There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. The last 2 weeks have been crazy and chaotic. After Israel attacked Iran on June 13, Iran responded with its IRBMs and drones. Then Donald Trump, of course, asked the 10 million people of Tehran to evacuate, demanded total surrender, and threatened to topple the government and even assassinate the Ayatollah Khamenei. And yesterday, when West Asia was in fact on the brink, Donald Trump declared a ceasefire and announced on his Truth Social app, "God bless Iran and Israel." I am Alishan Jafri and you're watching The Wire. To make sense of this senselessness, we have Bashir Ali Abbas, Senior Research Associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research and former Fellow at the Stimpson Center. He's known for his sharp explainers on West Asia in the Indian Express. Very handy for anyone trying to understand this conflict from an Indian strategic lens. In this conversation, we'll talk about many things: the origin of the conflict and the recent escalation and sudden de-escalation, the global reactions, especially from India and Pakistan, and the wider consequences of this war. Thank you so much, Bashir, for joining me.
Thank you, Alishan. It's my pleasure to be here.
Bashir, before we get into the specifics, let me begin by asking you, when 2 weeks ago, the United States and Iran, they were very close to having a deal. What brought us here?
As we saw that in April, when indirect negotiations between the Iranians and the Americans began in Muscat, we saw that both the Americans and the Iranians were showing that they are engaging in this with enough good faith to cater to the other side's needs as well, that both sides were looking to meet at a middle ground. The Americans weren't taking a very hardline position that begins with Iran giving up all its rights to enrich uranium on their soil, right? And that is why I think you remember that there were a lot of positive statements from both sides that things are looking good. We've just started and we'll see how things progress. By the time you have about 2 to 3 rounds of talks, including those in Rome, I think somewhere around the middle, we can distinctly observe that the American position becomes far more entrenched and far more hardline, in the sense that Iran cannot have the rights to enrich uranium on its own soil. What the Americans were still offering was that a consortium, possibly including the United States and the Arab states and other nations of the world, would provide nuclear fuel for Iranian nuclear power plants, right? Now, again, this is something that has happened before, but something we can discuss later. But the key point here is, up till that point in time, where everybody said we are getting closer to the draft, all of the information that's available in the public domain about what the contours of the draft are seemed in some ways similar to every other negotiation that the Iranians have had with their Western counterparts in the past. And at each of those points in time, the Israelis have criticized it as vociferously as they could. I would argue that Benjamin Netanyahu would be in a worse position compared to the past if he sees his own, in his words, his best friend in the White House again embark on a deal that his predecessors did, especially Obama, with whom he had a very fraught relationship.
He was in fact quite happy when Trump walked out of the JCPOA.
Absolutely. He was extremely happy, and at that time so were the Arab states, but well, Netanyahu more than the others. So in this case, I would argue that I think there had been some influence on the Americans, whether Israeli or otherwise, we can't ever tell conclusively, but the Americans hardened their position. But whatever be the influence, I think the Americans also knew that this is a point that for the Iranians would be a non-starter.
When Israel attacked Iran, they had a very clear objective in mind, or at least in the public domain, they had declared that they'll topple the Iranian government, they'll replace the Ayatollah's regime, and Iran will have no nuclear enrichment left after their war is over. Were they able to achieve any of their objectives?
Shan, I would argue that along with everybody else in the world, I think the Israelis know even better that neither of those objectives are achievable with air action alone. In every past instance where you've had forced changes in government, most recently in Syria, but before that, the most infamous in the Middle East is the removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. It was a result of action on the ground, right? Now, in the case of the Israeli objectives, which I said are twofold, the first one about nuclear dismantlement, you have decades of analysis by experts far more senior to me who have maintained that you cannot achieve that goal of complete nuclear dismantlement with air action alone. And I think the Israelis also knew that, right? So I think it's a function of that knowledge that they also had to push for a larger, for a broader route, which is a little more ephemeral, towards that ultimate objective by at least trying to change the regime in Iran, in their words.
But they did seem to catch Iran off guard initially.
They very much did. That is why you see the target profile that Israel chose in Iran. It's not just nuclear sites. They went after Iranian energy sites. They went after the Iranian military infrastructure, not just in terms of weaponry, but in terms of top organization, to sort of completely remove those bastions of the regime's power and in the eyes of everybody else, in the hope that you would have a sort of Iranian popular revolt. But I really doubt that the Israelis themselves believe that this is something that would happen. I would say that perhaps the most achievable objective for the Israelis was the most volatile element of any strategy of war, which is hope. Hope that the Americans would join in.
Did that hope materialize?
It did, but only to a certain degree. It certainly did not manifest in the way that the Israelis would have liked. Because if you for a second consider that the Israelis were looking to, for the lack of a better term, subvert the American negotiating position because they didn't like where the negotiations were heading, then the United States also had enough agency to subvert this Israeli attempt itself. Because the moment Donald Trump makes sure that the United States, in the words of the New York Times, joins the war, it also gives the Americans more control. Right? So if you can then calibrate the means that you apply, it is still a big spectacle, no doubt. B-2 Spirit bombers flying from the US mainland and striking Isfahan, Natanz and Fordo. But at the same time, you don't really need to worry about the efficacy of those strikes because you can declare victory. But at the same time, you also now have a little more political agency, at least publicly, to push back against the Israeli aims. And we all saw in the last 24 hours the rupture that has shown itself in the US-Israel relationship, because I don't think that, again, Netanyahu's best friend in the White House has chastised Israel so publicly and so vocally.
And I think no other US president possibly could have done that. But that is the thing with Trump. He's so unpredictable. After the early Israeli gains, he was so much into it. He thought that this is his moment and it's going to be a cakewalk. But the moment he realized that it's not going to be a cakewalk, he just backtracked and left the Israelis where they were.
No, I completely agree. Maybe it's a little counterintuitive, but I'll try to nuance this a little further. We've never had a US president in history whose main form of communication with the world is on his own social media platform and half the time
Truth
in all
Social.
caps, right? Which is Truth Social. But here is President Trump, and during his first term, we all got a taste of it. And now, as you can see, the world sort of tries to adapt to his lingo so that you can pander to the president and his needs. But allow me to make this argument that while Trump certainly is mercurial, volatile, unpredictable, whatever you wish to call him, but there is one thing that he has been largely consistent about right from the time that he has been campaigning, is that, and this position goes even farther back when it comes to Donald Trump, is that he never really encouraged war with Iran. At multiple points in time, he said that he would like to make a deal. It's only as a secondary position that he said, if that deal doesn't happen, then some very bad things will happen, in his characteristic style. But his first preference always was a deal. From January, even in February, when he sort of reimposes sanctions, we see Khamenei, just February of this year, say that it will be dishonorable to continue to negotiate with the Americans, especially with somebody like Donald Trump. But even he really did not remove room for negotiations.
Exactly. And, that's the thing with Trump. I think when he posted that he can assassinate Khamenei and he asked 10 million people of Tehran to evacuate, I remember that I tweeted, this man can tweet the exact opposite just 2 days later, and
exactly.
this is what he did.
Yeah.
So do you think that Trump's own characteristics as a person, they were a huge factor in stopping all of this?
I'm not entirely sure, because his tweets reveal his attempts to retroactively show the world that he had agency and control. I'll just give you two examples here. The first one is on June 13th, early on June 13th, when the Israelis launched their strikes on Iran. One of the very first statements that comes out of the US administration is, you have the US Vice President, you have the Secretary of State, who say that this was unilateral action by Israel. Right? I'm talking of June 13th. This was unilateral, one. And second, that the United States is not involved. The next day, you have reporters asking Trump that, did you know the Israelis were doing this? And that's when he sort of takes it to heart, and he says, he makes it clear here that he did not just know it, but he also had control, that he allowed it to happen. Now it's the jury is out whether you want to take that with a pinch of salt, whether that's only his own sort of shredded ego speaking, or if it's something else. Uh, the second is this whole question of regime change. This is a larger conversation, I know, but just to illustrate as an example for this conversation, is that again, when we were in that gray area in the 3-4 days before the US strikes on Fordo, the US was making it clear that regime change is not its objective. Even when the Fordo strikes happened, we know credibly, because of Arab media reports now, that there was private communication, indirect or direct, from the Americans to the Iranians that our strikes are over. We are willing to negotiate if you return to the table. They've always said this. And third, that we're not looking towards regime change in Iran, right? And the word itself is very obfuscatory, but that's for later. But again, after that, you have somebody ask Donald Trump that, would you be interested? And then he sort of gives in instantly and says, why not? Make Iran great again, right? And then he goes and again puts another tweet on a post on Truth Social where he says MEGA, right? Because why not? But that didn't really mean anything in terms of substance.
And what also explains his mercurial nature is the fact that he was calling them, evil people,
Yeah.
threatening to literally assassinate the head of their state. And then from that position to simply say that these are great people and God bless the people of Iran, God bless Iran and Israel, and to, just say, just mention these two in the same breath and say that
To
these are bad
hyphenate them.
boys. These are bad boys, quote unquote. They don't know what the fuck is wrong with them.
Yeah, that's exactly the language that he used, and it's like we're in an era where such unparliamentary words are completely normalized even on the world stage. But basically, he hyphenated Iran and Israel, since
He
hyphenation is the
has.
word of the day, right? But again, here there's no defense of Trump whatsoever and his style of politicking. We can have a debate about how effective it is, but just to point out that in the region itself, 10 years ago, but still in the grand scheme of things, 10 years is nothing. You had the Iranians and the Saudis go at each other's throats rhetorically, right? You had Ayatollah Khamenei basically, in effect, not verbatim, imply that the Saudis were betraying the cause of Islam, and well, Riyadh used to always push back, right? Especially because they consider themselves as the custodian of Islam's holiest sites. But
Now they're the
yeah,
brotherly Islamic Republic.
exactly. 8 years
Under
later,
attack.
they are brotherly Islamic republics. Now you have IRGC naval vessels in Emirati ports. The same IRGC that was infamous for allegedly mining ships that were headed to Emirati
In
ports in the
fact,
past.
accused of helping that Houthi attack on the Saudi,
On yes, on both the
for
Emirati as
the
well as the
Emirati oil fields, I think.
yes, absolutely. So in Trump's case, it's just because he uses words and posts, it just hits us a little more, visually, because this is a man saying something. But if you look at actual events on the ground, such contradictions have always been common, not just in the region, but globally. As I said, it's just both his style as well as the way that he crunches timelines that is unprecedented, that has that shock value.
Yeah, Bashir, we'll come to Trump later.
Yeah.
But explain to me first, after that initial shock
Hmm.
that the Iranians received with Israel's brutal and devastating attacks, how did they recover, one? And how were they able to hold back against, all opinions in the Western press, both with glee and also strategy that this is something that's going to be a cakewalk for Israel and it's going to end very soon? What is, the mindset and the strategy of the Islamic Republic of Iran that allowed them to, that gave them this room to, hold on?
Nishan, that really is the question, and there are so many different angles to approach this from. But just again, allow me to start from a slightly sociological perspective, which is that prior to the Israeli attacks, even prior to the current violence in West Asia and Israel's genocidal violence in Gaza, we know that inside Iran there was a lot of trouble. The Masa Amini protests were only the sort of tip of the iceberg, because people were channeling a lot of their inner grievances against the Iranian regime. The Iranian parliament sacked Pezeshkian's own economic minister, right? Abdul Nasser Hemmati. It's clear that the economy is a big driver of Iranian strategy vis-a-vis negotiations with the West. But again, this conversation we can have later. Specifically about how the Iranians were looking at Israel's strike. One thing I think is now categorically evident, is that the Iranians do not want this war. They never wanted this war, right? Even now, if you look at the IRGC's messaging when they launched their operation against the Al Udeid airbase, they said that we are retaliating against the imposed war on Iran, the war that Israel imposed, right? So they instantly frame it as a defensive action. At one level, we've seen that that's caused a lot of national consolidation, glossed over a lot of fractures. They aren't gone, certainly not gone. They're still there, very much there. But the fact that you had this national unity, I think it allowed the Iranians to bolster one strategy that we've always known whenever it comes to any other power fighting Israel, is that the threshold of victory is very different. For Israel, the threshold of victory vis-a-vis Iran is absolutist and maximal. That you completely remove the Iranian nuclear program, and you change the regime. That is as absolutist as it gets, and that demands the application of military force that is commensurate with that objective. For the Iranians, that is not the threshold. For the Iranians, it's not merely survival, but again, that word is too conflatory. But for the Iranians, it's simply the ability to retaliate and to continue hitting Israel, right? And I've said this elsewhere, that each time the Iranians launch missiles, they don't just have to fight the Israeli air defense systems, which are three-layered. They meet those Israeli air defense systems only later. They have to beat American naval-based air defense assets as well as land-based air defense assets in the Persian Gulf, in the Red Sea, and in the Mediterranean as well, because we saw that US Navy ships in the Mediterranean also helped with Israel's AD effort. What is curious, and for which I haven't seen any credible answer out there, and I certainly don't have the answer myself, is how the Iranians managed to first hold back their advanced solid fueled missiles and to first use most of their liquid fueled missiles against Israel, but to first successfully guard these from Israeli air attacks. And it's clear that the Israelis had complete air supremacy over in Iranian airspace. But to not only guard these, hold them back, but also then use it effectively, including after the US strikes. And all of this is unprecedented in history, right? The IRGC proudly announced that they used the Khorramshahr 4, which is the Khyber Shikan missile, solid fueled missile, which they claim to be
supersonic missile.
Yes, they claim to be hypersonic, but again, that terminology is debatable. But nonetheless, the point is now everybody has seen that Iran's ability to also hit Israel's urban centers and to increase Israel's costs, right? And let's not forget that in the world, it was a very different world back then. But in 1967, in the 6-day war, the Israelis wiped out the Egyptian Air Force while it was still largely on the ground, and in 6 days the action was over. Here we are already calling it a 12-day war. Now, these comparisons might be a very simplistic, I know, but just to illustrate for your viewers that the very fact that Iran kept up its defensive action, which in the Iranian sense, it's an offensive action, but it's more of offensive defense, right? Because they're responding to Israel. That itself for them is victory. And as we've seen from the Wall Street Journal report, that the Israelis were also slowly facing issues with their interceptors gradually running out. So we know that things weren't, all rose tinted for the Israelis either. A lot of other actors in the region.
Yeah, that is what I was coming to.
Yeah.
And we know for the last 2 years, especially when Israel started its genocide in Gaza, we've seen one after the other, the Iranian allies in the region, Israel just dismantle them. And Hezbollah, obviously, I don't consider Hezbollah as a spent force. Hamas, it's still not over, despite it being reduced to, Gaza getting reduced to double. Israel has not been able to get back its hostages. And third, the fall of Assad in Syria.
Yeah.
So Iran had this policy of strategic patience, and that's been its policy for a very long time. And this policy, do you think this policy, to some extent, did not work for the Iranians? And in fact, it was when Iran took part in an actual offensive against Israel to defend itself that worked. If Iranians were, I think at this point, in fact, talking to the Israelis or trying diplomatic ways to sort this out, in fact, Israel would have wiped them off. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, there are many things in that question, especially since you started off with all of the other actors in the region. If you'll allow me to sort of break it down from the perspective of each of those actors, but I'd like to tackle the latter half of your question first. This whole idea of Iranian strategic patience. I don't think there's any reason to believe that the Iranians have given up on strategic patience, because I would say that Iran's strategy of strategic patience did not yield them benefits if the Iranians initiated military action or completely refused to negotiate with the Americans or maintained a very entrenched hardline position with a view of continuing this war with the great and little Satan in their rhetoric for as many years as they need to. The Iranians could argue, since the IRGC and a lot of Iranian spokespersons have been saying that they could fight this war for years, they could ride out at least in the US midterms. Because again, the Iranians are also smart because they know how Trump works. They have dealt with him in the past, right? Mostly in a negative sense. But Iran's strategy of strategic patience is why the Iranians were at the table. It's also why Iran constantly kept saying, despite the historic first in the 45 years of the Islamic Republic of an Israeli attack on Iranian soil, to think that the Iranian regime at that point would still say that if you stop, we will negotiate, is unprecedented.
They were also using other ways to threaten the US. For example, this attack, before this attack on the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, they were threatening to close down the Strait of Hormuz. And also, apart from it, they were threatening to, make it very difficult for the United States economically. And they said, we are going to get hurt, but we'll make sure that we leave with you with a bloody nose.
Exactly.
And I think that is something that the Americans perhaps took very seriously.
Yeah, they did. So two things here, right? One is the question of the proxy actors, for the lack of a better term, and the second is that of the Strait of Hormuz. Would you wish me to go back to the question of the non-state actors and then come to this? Right. So this whole idea
also,
of
let me add to it. There was a very serious threat from the Houthis in the Red Sea.
Yes, absolutely, and that's crucial. So thanks for bringing that up. Is firstly, let's turn the clock back, because it's so important to keep doing that. On October 7, 2023, when Hamas sort of conducted its terror attacks in Israel, how are all of these other actors in the region placed? And how did these actors sort of behave across the next 10 to 15 months while the Israeli campaign in Gaza became disproportional enough to warrant cases against it at the ICJ on the charges of violating the Genocide Convention and credible assessments of disproportionate force, right? But where were these actors placed? Hezbollah, and let's start there because they are arguably still now the most important Iranian instrument of influence in the region. Since 2019, you've had massive, again, unprecedented protests in Lebanon vis-a-vis Lebanon's economic situation and the way that their tripartite government system is able to handle it. You had protests that were bold enough to question Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has enjoyed support from large sections of Lebanon, especially in South Lebanon, of course, but across the country in the past. But that was a time where it became heated enough for Hezbollah to sort of reconsider a lot of its domestic posturing. Things got worse in 2022, where everybody remembers the port explosion in Beirut, where everybody questioned the security of Hezbollah's arms caches and its explosive material and the harmful effects of a lot of its local tactics and strategy, right? I would say that Hezbollah had enough domestic challenges to focus on itself first. And that is why, for the next 10 to 15 months, you had two things. Hezbollah was only engaging in a very calibrated, measured action vis-a-vis Israel. The Israelis were striking at will, but Hezbollah was also limiting its rocket attacks to sort of northern Israel, but never engaging in that full-scale ground invasion or war that it was in some ways arguably created, because the Iranians, one among their many reasons for cultivating Hezbollah as such a powerful force, is to prevent what just happened today, which is direct attacks on the Iranian homeland, especially from Israel, right? But again, going back to that 2023-2024 period, whenever Hassan Nasrallah spoke, he always made sure to retain that ambiguity, right? He never really committed Hezbollah to war. He always criticized Israel, expressed solidarity with the Iranians, with the Palestinians fighting Israel, of course, but he never committed to the war. At the end, when the Israelis, when they did fight that war, it was because Israel initiated it and was fought on Israel's terms. But again, it played out very similar to the past, just at the Litani River, and then ultimately the Israelis gradually, to a large extent, withdrawing, right? Even now, when you see Naim Qasim's, the current Hezbollah Secretary General's speech, similar ambiguity, because that internal calculus has not gone away, and these things don't disappear magically, right? Even in South Lebanon, when Israeli strikes were happening, you had consolidation in Lebanon, even vis-a-vis Hezbollah. But that doesn't mean that they want Hezbollah to go to war. It's for things to stop so that they can focus on recuperating. That's Hezbollah, right? You look at Syria. Syria is the real puzzle here. It's one of those cases where it's about the dog that didn't bark at night, right? If you reference Arthur Conan Doyle, that Bashar al-Assad never really allows Syria to be used as a principal theater against Israel across these months. Assad also wanted to show the Iranians that he has now secured his own agency, right? Because let's not forget Qasem Soleimani, who was also assassinated under the first Trump administration, was crucial in ensuring Iranian support to shore up Syrian support for Bashar al-Assad, or at least to secure his position. But now, when Assad has been welcomed back with open arms into Arab institutions, I think there was this desire on his part to also show autonomy. So we saw that there were some subtle ruptures in the Syria-Iran relationship. But what was not there is any crucial role that Syria played in supporting the anti-Israeli effort. Just two minor points here about the other actors, because this is not something that is so easily discussed when we look at these things, right? And when things changed in Syria, Al-Jolani arguably has an even more reason to not have anything to do with Israel's war, despite his earlier anti-Israel rhetoric, because he has to focus on national consolidation even more now, or at least to show that he's succeeding, right? But then let's come to the militias in Iraq. They are crucial because it's arguably, I think, if I'm not wrong, the only country where you have at least a 45 to 50,000 strong force that can be counted as an Iranian proxy, but only in a limited sense, as well as a large number of US troops, both in the Green Zone as well as other bases in Erbil, in Ain al-Assad, right? All in the same country. The Iraqi government's attempt has always been to disallow any major engagement between these two. It has always been difficult. But for the Iraqi forces there, their priority has always been for an eventual American exit from Iraq. You know who else has always committed to withdrawing the Americans from Iraq? Donald Trump. So in the past, he has always said that we will look towards working to first reduce US presence and eventually get them out. The Baghdad government has used that as leverage to tell these militias who became powerful because of their successful fight against a lot of jihadi forces, especially the Islamic State, that why don't you disarm now, because we are going to help you diplomatically and militarily to ensure that we bargain strong enough with the Americans and make sure that the Iranians don't use Iraq as a proxy battleground, right? Lastly, and here we come to the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf, is the Houthis. Our memories are short. The Houthis entered the war with a new casus belli in December 2023, where they said that we now wish to make sure that the costs that Israel faces for its genocidal action in Gaza is international, which is why we will attack Israeli-linked shipping, especially in the Red Sea. But the Houthis have fought a war of attrition in the last 15 years against Arab forces, right? Especially former Yemeni government forces as well.
Saudi Arabia.
Exactly, from 2015, 2016, when Mohammed bin Salman was the defense minister, he launches Operation Decisive Storm. If you look at the numbers that the Yemen Data Project presents, the Houthis strikes, and this is all before the Israeli action. This is before the Israeli-US action that happened last year against the Houthis, right? They have withstood thousands of airstrikes, which were again with US weaponry that the Arab coalition had. They survived. They were consolidated enough to mount a fresh offensive with an entirely new war objective in late 2023. So again, when the US sort of enters the war against Houthis, because there's no easier way to draw the US into a military conflict than to threaten international shipping. And once the Houthis did that, once the Trump administration also launched this new bombing campaign against Yemen, because under the Biden administration, you already had two other maritime security missions that were underway, which the Arab states did not join, right? It was ironic to me that in early 2024, Saudi Arabia, which was the principal nemesis of the Houthis, was advising the Americans to not bomb Yemen.
Yeah.
Right, that's again testament to how volatile the region is. But simply,
and it's also very quickly changing.
Absolutely, but the point is that the Houthis showed that they can effectively choke merchandise and global shipping in the Red Sea. But what did not happen at that point in time was that the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, where global energy trade is very, very dependent on that narrow choke point, that wasn't affected. The Persian Gulf was largely calm. It was a Red Sea, and you could question Iran's capabilities to actually block the strait. The idea is that Iran's closing the Strait of Hormuz would be extremely detrimental at three levels.
Almost an act of war against the United States.
Absolutely, and I don't think that's an exaggeration at all. First is that. The second is that this rapprochement with the Arab states would completely go out the window. And the third is that Iran, which is militarily starved of allies, and I focus on the word militarily, uh, these allies would also be, for the lack of better term, very angry. Right?
Yeah,
exactly. But at the end of that first great conflict, the Iranians were sort of convinced that they needed a nuclear weapon. They showed an ability to, at least to a limited degree, enrich uranium, especially with some help from the infamous AQ Khan network. But when the Iranians announced this enrichment capacity, that's when it got them the full might of Western sanctions, a rupture, a complete rupture in the relationship with Europe, and a breakdown in any trust whatsoever that was left between Tehran and the Americans, right? And let's not forget that during the Iran-Iraq war, the Iranians also infamously did buy anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles from the United States when the NSC of the United States was Robert McFarlane, the Iran-Contra affair, right? But by the 90s, all of this was gone because of the Iranians looking towards enriching their own uranium, potentially towards a bomb. Until again, you have the next great conflict, which is again right next door
Iraq,
in 2003,
invasion of
the
Iraq.
invasion of Iraq by the Americans. For the Iranians, who were getting very uncomfortable, the purported American aim was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, right? Colin Powell's famous speech. If you are at that point in time and you have American troops next door in Iraq, and you also have in the past attempted to make nuclear weapons,
charges.
Yes, and you will continue to be accused of the same charges. There's a reason why George Bush, again, for reasons that are mostly by now criticized very vociferously, included Iran in the axis of his axis of evil, right?
Yeah.
Very wrongly. But in this case, that's when in 2003 you have this series of developments that start coming out vis-a-vis Khamenei's fatwa against nuclear weapons. That fatwa is there on Khamenei's Farsi website even now.
In 2019, he in fact tweeted that getting nuclear weapons is haram. But
Yeah.
and in 2015, if you look at it, when the JCPOA was signed, I think it's called the John Javad
Yeah.
John Javad deal. And
Yeah.
if you look at it, at that point, people in Iran and in fact across political lines, except for a couple of hardliners who are in fact very strong, but nobody in Iran wanted
Yeah.
nuclear weapons. And
Yeah.
that was the sentiment, I think, in 2015, 2016.
Yeah.
And then Soleimani was killed. And now in 2025, I think the sentiment, at least among the Iranian people, that has completely shifted.
Yeah.
They think that getting nuclear weapons is the ultimate form of deterrence.
Yeah, I'll just get to that.
I don't know if
right
that's what the Iranian government is going to do, but
I would say
that is a sentiment,
yeah,
at least among the people, and that is not a fringe thought now anymore.
absolutely not. It's not a fringe. The thing is that every country's strategic community, so to speak, always makes such cases. The thing is that every government always has a choice, which is, and this relates to the earlier conversation we were having about strategic patience and its importance, right? Especially now that they've sustained a 12-day war with Israel, even though it's entirely standoff. But just coming back to that point, if you look at the fatwa on Khamenei's website, it still rationalizes it based on the Iran-Iraq war, saying that because the Iranians have been a victim of such horrid weapons, the Iranians deem such a weapon to be haram, right? Especially Khamenei himself, and that's a religious edict, at least effectively. Now, you can question its credibility, you can question the Iranians' commitment or adherence to this fatwa, or whether it will change in the future or not. But so far, that has remained. My question now is, just like twice in the past, now you have this third great conflict that has just happened, which is again unprecedented, involving both Israel and the United States, the nemesis in Tehran's view of the Iranian revolutionary government, right? At the end of this third conflict, we could see a change in their view of the necessity of nuclear weapons as the ultimate deterrent against against the possibility of a repeat of any such incident, right? But there is this other pragmatic factor. And as I said, with Iranians, it can always either be desperation or pragmatism. And that is the need to build up conventional capabilities, right? We've had two crises recently within a span of 2 months, right? Less than that, which is between India and Pakistan, and now between Iran and Israel, and Iran and the United States. Both of these were entirely standoff, right, where the beyond visual range using drones, missiles, aircraft to a limited degree, not to a limited degree, certainly not if you consider the B2's involvement, but this is now the age of standoff warfare, and the Iranians are not alien to the evolution of the global of battlefields around the world, right? So I would argue that the Iranians, apart from their economic need, which is very, very severe because of their abject conditions, strategically also, if Iran is still up for negotiations with the United States, I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians focus on building up their conventional capabilities first, right? Whether or not this question on Iranian road to nuclear weaponization, whether it's credibly answered by the Iranians as yes or no, that's still
In
up in the air.
2020, in fact, they had a chance to buy the Chinese J-10Cs that the Pakistanis
Yeah.
used against India in their Bunyan al-Marsus. And in
Yeah.
fact, they also had the chance, the Russians, as they've argued, to buy the S-400 systems. They did
Yeah.
not do that. So,
Yeah.
and that's also, in a way, being seen by many in Iran as a mistake.
Yeah.
They could have done that when the sanctions were lifted in 2020, but they did not do that, perhaps. And I think you're right that they'll do that. But let's now, come to other questions, and let's try and talk about what were the global reactions, what was India's reaction, and what should have been India's reaction. Also, I think the other day you wrote in the Indian Express about Pakistan's reaction.
Yeah.
So let's discuss these things. So let's start with the Western reactions, in fact. I mean, I had tweeted about it. Many of these statements from Stammer and Carney, they were verbatim. They were same. And so for somebody who lives in India, for people who live in the global south, how do these statements appear? I don't know if the Indian government does not take objection to it. Many in India haven't taken objection to it, but they come across as imperialist. They come across as, in fact, colonial, where a Western power or these great powers have that, power of consent. They treat you like children, and then that's horrific. You are not condemning the Israeli actions on one side. On the other hand, there's extreme criticism of what Iran has done, and if you even look at the scale of damage and deaths in terms of just civilian deaths, Israel has killed far more civilians in Iran than Iran has killed in Israel. And in fact, what Israel is doing in Gaza, nobody needs to even argue that it's a clear case of a genocide. But these statements of restraint, these statements, and these are just one-sided statements, and we don't get to see anything concrete. And the very basis of Western diplomacy in that case, it becomes very hollow. It comes across as very hollow to a person like me.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Especially
that's obviously that's a very moralistic reading of these statements,
which doesn't need to be less or more important than any interest-based or pragmatic argument, right? But I get what you're saying, especially when it comes to the statements that European leaders have made. But look, especially since you brought up Gaza, before June 12th, in the 2 weeks preceding the Israeli attack on Iran, the European criticism of Israel was at an all-time high, right? While this criticism didn't amount to anything, at least in terms of stopping Israeli actions in Gaza, while its operations were on across the last 15 months. But the moment you had more and more evidence of Israel killing people lined up, starving population, 100% of Gaza's population now risks facing famine according to the United Nations. But starving people lining up to gain access to humanitarian aid, and Israel sort of
guns them down,
right? This issue in particular, for some reason, has ticked off the Europeans much more than anything else, right? To the extent that you had British sanctions on the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who, by the way, is not just a finance minister. Effectively, he's also
a far-right ideologue and an extremist.
Yes, he is all of that, but he also has enough administrative powers over the significant parts of those 3 zones in the West Bank, right? So he's an important figure, as well as against Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the former National Security Minister and
Interior Affairs Minister, yeah.
Yes, and arguably the most vociferous in terms of his bellicose rhetoric against the Palestinians, which is incredibly genocidal and racist, right? But in this case, you had this sort of tilt in Europe against Israeli strategic logic of whatever they were trying to do in Gaza. And let's not forget, continuous US assessments have said that their operational objectives are not being met. But you also had an upcoming conference at the UN, which Saudi Arabia and France was going to host jointly.
Exactly, nobody was talking
The
about it.
yeah,
I think you're right in saying, in suggesting, in fact,
yeah.
that Israelis' one objective was also to take the attention away from
Yeah,
Gaza.
because regardless of intent or cause, in effect, it certainly did. It certainly did take focus away.
It did, but also there's huge hypocrisy, and even from a strategic perspective, now that I look at it, every time the Israelis do something, or in fact any Western state commits a crime, all these Western states, for some reason, the whites come together and rally in support, whether
Yeah.
they're right or wrong, and that in itself is an assault on the basic principles they themselves seem to propound. I mean, I haven't seen any. We did not vote on the resolution on Gaza 1. On the Iranian conflict, we had no stand, and in fact, to me, I think India is underplaying its own strengths, and India is, it just comes across as one of these states whose opinion doesn't matter by keeping quiet.
Right. So, since you were speaking of the European reactions, I completely agree when it comes to this, the imperialistic framework. But again, even there, France has always attempted to sort of carve out space for itself. We had brief comments by Macron when he said the US strikes were also violation of international law.
And in fact,
But
Macron also, when Trump was going back to DC,
yes,
Macron said
yes,
Trump
yes,
is going to
we
broker a
remember.
ceasefire, and
Yeah.
Trump abused him and slammed him, and in fact said Macron should keep quiet.
Yeah, this is a good segue into the Indian interest here. But before that, when Trump went back, he went to have lunch with self-designated Field Marshal Asim Munir, right, in the White House. If you look at the Pakistan-Iran relationship, it by no means is a natural partnership. There are more obstacles in that relationship, which are far more structural and enduring than opportunities
In fact,
for
in
them
2024, they had strikes against each
Yes,
other.
and 2024 was only the latest in a series of such border skirmishes, and skirmishes is underplaying it across the last decade. You had IRGC special forces that undertook operations on Pakistani soil. In fact, I mean, we called it surgical strikes in 2016, the Indian action, but the Iranians had actually done something very similar years before that. They didn't call it a surgical strike, but at the time, again, they were acting against different groups. But the point is that the Pakistani and Iranian forces have very much clashed against each other. They have remained opposed against each other's interests in Afghanistan. And the most important part here is in the geopolitics of the region. Iran is a crucial component in India's grand strategy, and key parts of which are opposed to Pakistan's own grand strategy for the region.
Chabahar is a
Yes,
big
Chabahar and Gwadar, right? The sort of almost twin ports that are, oriented towards very different objectives.
Asim Munir seems to be having the best time of his life. He's getting jets from the Chinese, the
Yeah.
stealth jets from the Chinese. Meanwhile, he's being hosted by Donald Trump. And Trump, on one hand, is saying that Asim Munir will support me in my offensive against Iran. But on social media and other places, you just see India as the biggest supporter of Israel's offensive, when that's not the case.
Yeah.
Obviously, India has been quiet, but India hasn't actively taken part in Israel's offensive at any point of time.
Absolutely not. Yeah, and this is a very interesting conversation. So let's just explore key elements of this. The Asim Munir lunch. It's important to remember it was pre-scheduled, right? He was already there on June 12th.
There's no statement from the White House.
There's no statement from the White House. The only statement you have is from the DGISPR. In 3 days, we saw how Pakistan has just managed to try and take advantage of whatever opportunity it gets, where you nominate the president, the US president, for a Nobel Prize, and the next day you condemn US action. So I don't think I need to add anything to show the contradictions.
Trump has a sweet tooth of flattery.
Absolutely. So, the Pakistanis are trying what they can. What the Pakistanis cannot match is the kind of grand strategic bargains that India strikes with the United States across sectors, right? So, the Pakistani strategy has been to try and pander to the president's personal needs. But if you deal with a volatile president, it can also very much backfire, right? So, the Pakistanis at the end of the day were caught between, the devil and the deep sea, where they were trying to fight fires on both sides, where even the Iranians claim that the Pakistanis are going to support them with a nuclear weapon against Israel if Israel struck Iran with nuclear weapons. It was Mohsen Rezai, who's not a nobody in the Iranian system.
I saw that video on Press TV.
Yeah, which was it was an authentic video. It was in Farsi. It was only the English dub that was added, because of which the Pakistanis claimed that the whole video was fake, which is not the case.
Yeah,
right?
but they did not, they did not deny or condemn.
They didn't. Yeah,
They just said the video is fake.
Yeah, so that also takes hits as to the degree to which the Iranians can look at their literal neighbor for support at this unprecedented time in history.
I don't think Iranians look at Pakistan for support.
Absolutely not, yeah.
But at the same time, Pakistan, by presenting itself, I suppose it is presenting itself as a very reliable partner to the United States, and Trump is somebody who would perhaps buy it. Obviously, as we have already discussed, he's a president of a very mercurial nature, and he's very unpredictable. But as of now, and that is my personal reading, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Pakistanis are having a better time. They are in the conversation. We are absent. So we've seen how Pakistan has been in the conversation. And the Americans are talking about them. The Iranians, obviously, they have been talking about the Pakistanis. And the narrative, at least on social media, is that Pakistan is a great friend of Iran and also of the United States at the same time. While Pakistan, in their rhetoric, they have been absolutely anti-Israel. That's the thing that they've mastered. Where does India stand? What is India doing?
Right, so I think because the question is premised on the Pakistani position, let's
start with Pakistanis first, briefly, and then get to India.
Very briefly, look, the Asim Munir lunch with President Trump was to a large extent a function of chance, right? Because the US president also came back from the G7 summit early. We still don't know what exactly they discussed. There is no White House statement. You only have a statement from DGISPR from Pakistan.
And also from Trump.
Yes, and DGISPR also has its own reasons to play up anything that they might have discussed. But it's clear that the Pakistanis, as again, they have history of doing this, would like to play both sides and see where they can gain maximum benefits from, right? When it comes to the United States, they wish to sort of reposition themselves as a key partner in the region. And no better time to do it when you have a conflict that involves their neighbor, and Pakistan's chief of army staff is also in the White House, right? So they had all the reasons to try and attempt this, and then next day nominate him for a Nobel Prize. And then the day after that, condemn the US action on Iran. Whereas vis-a-vis Iran, we are sure that there have also been communications enough for the Iranians, for General Mohsen Rezai to come out and say that the Pakistanis have assured them that Pakistan will attack Israel with nuclear weapons if Israel attacks Iran with nuclear weapons. Now, the Pakistanis have in effect, if not verbatim, sort of rejected any such commitment, because at least they've distanced themselves from it, right? But it's clear that the Pakistanis are sort of on the brink and trying to gain any kind of leverage that they can, especially at a time when that robust source of US-Pakistan cooperation in Afghanistan is gone, right? Currently, the US focus has shifted from an Afghanistan-centric global war on terror to a China-centric Indo-Pacific strategy. Although that's also under debate under the Trump presidency, but again, that's a larger conversation. So,
but let's come to India.
Yeah, that's where I'm coming. Right?
Yeah. Let me just reframe it for you. I personally feel, and that's a view that's shared by, in fact, many Indians. Sonia Gandhi wrote about it. The Congress Party has spoken up about it. I feel India's silence in some way not just hurts our strategic interests, but it shows us as an immoral force, an immoral middle force.
Yeah, look, again, these are heavy terms, and we have to be very clear that when we talk of silence, what do we mean, and silence on what? But I'd like to go
silence on Gaza, silence when our neighbors are attacked, silence, and at a time when we ourselves want global support. Just 40 days ago, we wanted global support when Operation Sindoor happened, and we were sending delegations to. We sent delegations to so many countries, Colombia, Venezuela, and whatnot. But the bottom line is that much of it, and I feel that, was for internal consumption. It did not, to my mind, make any real impact. You get real support only when you show real support to people, and by being quiet when people need your support, you can't get support. And that cannot be strategy.
You
I
could
suppose.
also turn that on its head and say that we are living in such a world where you could do without that support as long as you show that you have the might and the ability to use force to the ends that you desire. But again, that's an
Exactly.
intellectual debate that we can have later. I would like to tackle this sequentially. First is that, as we've sort of briefly discussed, that the Pakistan-Iran relationship also is by no means
It's volatile.
rosy. It's
I
very
agree.
volatile, and the fact that the Iranian and Indian interest in Chabahar is very deep. In fact, in the last 3 years, a lot of positive movement has happened in Chabahar, where we are working more to make sure that there are greater links for us to ensure a complete circumvention of Pakistan for access to Central Asia and Afghanistan, right? Again, that's an interesting aspect of this conversation, which we may come to later. Let's talk about the Indian position on two things that have happened in
One,
West Asia.
Gaza,
Yes,
and
the first is
second,
Gaza, and the second is Iran, right?
yeah,
Uh, First, on Gaza, I would argue that India has not been silent. I would say that India has not said enough. There are two different things. When it comes to the Indian position on Palestine, there is one thing that people sort of skip because the social media rhetoric is so much in favor of Israel that we tend to obfuscate and forget some crucial facts. In the last 11 years that this government has been in power and has gone stronger, had gotten stronger in 2019, the United Nations in each year takes up a set of recurring resolutions on many issues in the world, including that in Palestine, right? These resolutions have to do with the right of Palestinian self-determination, the right of Palestinian rights in occupied territories, the obligation on Israel to withdraw from occupied territories, not just in Palestine in the West Bank, but also in the Golan Heights in Syria, and a number of other such resolutions. Each year, India votes in favor of these resolutions.
let me just try to complicate it a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you think it is possible at this point of time, especially, to speak for the right of Palestinians without condemning the actions of the Israeli state in Gaza? And I'm not just speaking from a moralistic point of view, but it is a horrific genocide. And by not condemning it, where does India stand?
Look, I think and that's why I was just leading with this, that I was talking to a former Indian ambassador, and I think the pattern has always been that at least from the bureaucracy, from the Minister of External Affairs, and even certain government statements, regardless of what is happening, I think the Indian priority is to always ensure that we have enough room to maneuver and we don't foreclose any options for ourselves whatsoever. A lot of these words that India chooses are deliberately designed to ensure that we have space to function, right? So you and I could argue, and I very personally agree with this, right? That if you don't have, a criticism of Israel along with it, then the job is only half done. But I could also extend that argument a little and say that before these recent limited sanctions on a few Israeli ministers, at each point in time, when you have had efforts to condemn the Israelis, especially even the Arab states, they've been condemning the Israeli action day in and day out. But as long as you don't have punitive costs imposed on Israel, why will a state be compelled to change their course of action? Right? So I would argue that globally there has been that shortcoming.
It was a long conversation, and our viewers would really enjoy. And this was, in fact, we needed these nuances. But I still feel that India hasn't done enough, and India should do more. In fact, especially vis-a-vis Gaza, and in the case of Iran.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's certainly with regard to the former, because at least the latter conflict has ended.
Thank you so much, Bashir, for joining us, and please subscribe and join the wire.
It was my pleasure, Alishan. I was glad to be here.